Greetings, students. We are now doing Chapter 10 on global inequality. Now, for Chapter 10, now you're still going to have 3 videos this week, but for the most part, we're just focusing on the first 2 sections of the chapter. Yes, I do want you to read the entire chapter, but I don't really love the theories that they use in Section 3, so we won't be going over those too much. You're not responsible for them, do not worry about it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the things you are responsible for in Sections 1 and 2. So, first thing we need to understand is Immanuel Wallerstein's classifications of nations and why we use this, right? So probably a lot of you have heard people describe various nations, first world, second world, third world. That came after the Cold War, and was frankly not a very nice way of describing countries. If you're from a country that's considered third, and there are other countries that are considered first, it kind of places it on a hierarchy, right? And in a trying to be culturally relative, right? We're trying not to be ethnocentric. So Immanuel Wallerstein came up with this idea of ways that we could describe these nations without hierarchy, without privileging one nation over another. So you may think that's ridiculous, that's fine, but it's what we're learning here. So we have 3 nations in the classification system. The first one are core nations. America is a core nation. These are dominant capitalist countries, highly industrialized, technological, urbanized. Us, India, China, Britain, okay? Core nations. We're kind of the big boys. Then we have peripheral nations. This is the complete opposite end. So they have very little industrialization. What they often do have often represents cast-offs of core nations or whatever we decided to build there. Typically extremely unstable governments, inadequate social programs, and they're usually economic dependent on core nations for jobs, aid, pretty much everything. Then we have the in-between folks. Semi-peripheral nations. Semi-peripheral nations are interesting. They're not really powerful enough to dictate policy, but generally they're important enough because they have raw materials, an expanding middle class, that kind of thing. So they serve as a marketplace for core nations, while also using the labor and cheap land and things like that in peripheral nations. Best example I have for a semi-peripheral nation for you is Mexico, actually. So Mexico is a really good example of a semi-peripheral nation. They're not really a core nation, but they're not a peripheral nation, right? They have enough together in Mexico that they have a functioning infrastructure, all of that kind of thing. They do take advantage of those less wealthy nations, just like we do, but they're not really dictating policy. You know, they're not bossing the UN around like we are. So those are our 3 classifications for nations that we're going to be using in our global inequality section here. And we'll be watching a documentary this week on a peripheral nation. So we'll get to see what that looks like in action. All right, we have a couple other things we need to go through here. We also have these ideas of global stratification and social stratification, which might be confusing and you might think they're the same thing. They're not. Global stratification examines a number of factors, like a ton of factors, all kinds of things. Different types of prejudice, inequality, you know, all the things go into global stratification. So we're looking at lots and lots of data when we're looking at global stratification. Whereas social stratification covers social class and the standing of individuals. So where global stratification is much bigger, it's a macro thing, right? Social stratification is a micro thing. We're looking at how individuals are strewn about the social classes as opposed to nations being strewn about the social classes. So it's much easier and much more straightforward to do that because we don't have to take as many factors into consideration, right? There aren't as many pieces to that. Another key concept is that deindustrialization can lead to the disappearance of the middle class. This is something I imagine a lot of you are intimately familiar with here in the US of A. As we have deindustrialized, we have fewer middle class jobs, right? They're getting exported to other countries. And we'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward, but it's important to understand that we're not the only ones going through to this and that this is a common thing, that when you start to deindustrialize, you do start to lose that middle class. And then finally, we have education and its role in poverty. it's cyclical and it's interrelated. Education's one of those things that can really break poverty cycles. Um, and it can also lead to weird poverty cycles in other places. So, higher education in one country can lead to deindustrialization in another. And you're kind of like, huh? What? How is this possible? Okay, let's think about India. So, as India further increased its education of its populace and it started getting higher up on the social ladder here, they started taking away call center jobs, IT jobs, a lot of middle class jobs in America because the labor was cheaper, right? So that's an example of how higher education in one country, India, can lead to deindustrialization in another, America, right? As all those jobs are going over there. So that's our first chunk of keywords and concepts from this chapter, and I'll be back for some more.